You have a story about giving and stewardship. Would you tell that to me, please?
I'd love to. But I have to say that the story didn't really come into play for me. There was a lesson there, but I didn't learn it until much later. But the story goes something like this. I was probably 10 or 12 years old, sitting in a pew next to my dad at St. Mary's Episcopal Church in Eugene, Oregon, where I grew up. And I have to say that my dad always kind of puzzled me. He was a working man. He had rough hands. He made his living patching plywood panels at a local lumber mill. And he never had too much to say. And I think actually he was kind of, the world puzzled him too, because I think he had a hard time with mathematics and making enough money to take care of his family. But there he was, and it happened to be Stewardship Sunday at St. Mary's, and we had pledge cards. And he had a pledge card in front of him, and I watched him try to fill it out. And he could do it pretty well, filling out his name and address and all the things you have on the pledge card. But then he got to the line where it says how much you're going to promise to give each week or each month, whatever it was. And he just paused, and he thought for the longest, hardest time. And I was watching him, kind of wondering, what's he going to put in there? And my mind began to go, I hope that he's not too cheap. I hope that he doesn't embarrass our family by giving a ridiculously small amount. But I knew we didn't have much money. So I just kind of watched him, and finally he filled in a number. It was $3 a week. Now this was about 1960 or thereabouts. $3 a week was a lot of money to him. I know that at that point my school lunches cost $1.50 a week. So he was promising to give the church each week twice as much as it cost to feed his kid who was going to school. $3 would have probably been a tank of gas at that point. Gasoline wasn't nearly as expensive. So he was really committing himself to a pretty big chunk of money. And I watched him struggle with what he was going to give. And I was kind of proud of him when he didn't embarrass the family by being too cheap. Now, I mentioned a little while ago that this was a lesson I should have learned at the time, but it didn't really sink in until much later when I had my own family. And then it was a struggle for me. At first, when I started going back to church, I didn't put anything in the plate if no one was watching. If somebody was watching, I might put in $1 so that they would think that I was okay. But I was challenged in my giving. I was still in the Episcopal Church at the time, and St. Matthew's Episcopal Church here in Austin was having a building program, and they had a big kickoff dinner for this. And a man, David Barrow was his name. He was an architect, and he was pretty wealthy, I suppose. But he said at the time that he hadn't really started to understand about giving until someone challenged him, and they said, "David, I believe you could give twice as much as you are." And he allowed at the time that he was giving $10,000 a year to the church. Well, I guess this was probably 1990. It's still a lot of money. And he accepted that challenge. He doubled his gift to St. Matthew's Church at that time to $20,000, and he said, "I don't know where that money was going to come from, but you know what? It did. When I made it a priority, I could come up with the money to keep my promises." That struck me really hard, and I began to ponder about that, and that's when I began to get the message that my dad had tried to teach me when I was a 10 or 11-year-old boy. And I hope that that lesson has been growing and percolating in me, because Jerry and I struggled for a long time to get to the point where we could honestly say that we were tithing 10%. Now, God doesn't want us to be an accountant to figure out exactly what 10% is, but He wants us to give sacrificially. We need to learn to give sacrificially, not because He needs the money, but because that's what we do as Christians. We give back in gratitude for all the things that we've received. And when Jerry and I began to work on tithing, our plan was to, every time we got a raise or something like that, we would dedicate half of that raise to going towards tithing. And each time we got a raise, and thank God we got lots of raises during that time, we could add to the amount that we were setting aside for God's use. And that's when life began to get so much easier for us. When we were a young couple, we used to argue about money all the time. You know, I always felt like I didn't have enough. She always felt like she didn't have enough. But when we began to set aside more to give to God out of gratitude for what He's given us, lo and behold, we didn't argue about money anymore. What a blessing for us to be able to discover that money was not the most important thing in the world. In fact, we had the wherewithal to give away more than we ever thought that we could. And for the last 15 years, we have been able to tithe in the Episcopal Church and now at St. Elias. And the blessings we've received for that are just immeasurable. That's my story.